So our speaker is Professor Marc Stierand. He's an associate professor at Ecole Hôtelière of Lausanne, a very famous school for hospitality management, probably the most famous in the world. If you don't know anything about the school, it will suffice to tell you it's the first school that managed to get a Michelin star for its training restaurants. How does it sound? The school cafeteria has a Michelin star. Marc is going to talk to us about the link between creativity and aesthetics in the world of haute cuisine. Aesthetics are important for several reasons in creativity. One, a great deal of the value of products and services in the creative economy has to do with their aesthetic appeal, which is very important. Two, creativity in the creative economy is really propelled by individual level creative talent. So the aesthetics of something like the service or a product is a key differentiating factor. It's about uniqueness, so it's a competitive advantage. And the third aspect, which is really of interest of people, management researchers like me and Marc, is that the ability to create something that aesthetically is functional and works well, it means that the person, the people who do that, can really tackle with highly complex things, satisfying customer taste, satisfying the taste of reviewers, business imperatives, cultural imperatives, and all the other things. Marc has done the most interesting and extensive research over the years in this world. He's going to talk about it. A few years ago with two colleagues, we did a very, very large-scale review of everything that has been published in the academic bibliography literature about creative leadership between 1957 and 2014, and we have different conceptual baskets in our mind. One of them was called interesting stuff. And some of the papers that Marc published came at the very, very top of that list, really interesting work. Marc is a researcher in this field. He's a management professor, so he's someone who knows very well how these ideas work also in an organizational sense. And because as probably you know, or I hope you know, most of us who are business school professors, we used to have another life before. So in his previous life, he was a chef in a Michelin-starred restaurant. So he has this beautiful combination of ground zero, ground level practical experience and academic, and I'm fairly sure we're all going to enjoy them. So please welcome Marc Benjamin.
Kalispera. Now I have to continue in English, unfortunately. Well, thank you very much for having me tonight. I'm very honored to be here at Alba, and of course when Babis told me and when I learned about his new center of excellence in creative leadership, I didn't have to think for a second to accept the invitation, because we are still a relatively small group of people, of academics in the world interested in creativity. The whole world talks about innovation, of course, and understandably, because this is what at the end brings the money, brings the value. But if you think about innovation is actually an end result of a creative process. So it's actually very interesting to kind of at least try to understand what is happening before, and if we somehow can influence that positively, so that the likelihood of achieving innovation becomes bigger. Now, just a few words about myself. Similar to Babis, I just opened the first institute at Ecole Hôtelière de Lausanne called Institute of Business Creativity, and we work together with big industry clients. Our biggest at the moment is the Metro Group. Metro Group, probably you know it from cash and carrier markets for the independent restaurateurs, but until very recently, for example, Media Market was also part of the Metro Group. So a very large, very reliable client. We are very, very happy with them. It's a good cooperation, and we do practice-based research. So at the moment we look into a very important topic, how we can innovate vocational training and education in the hospitality industry, and I think that's a very important topic for Greece as well, because there is a worldwide struggle to actually find people, competent people for our industry, not only in the kitchen but also in the service and the hotels everywhere. And I think we have to rethink how we can actually motivate young people to work in that, what I think is a beautiful industry, but it's a very peculiar industry. It's long working hours, and basically you work when your friends and families enjoy a leisure time. But it's a beautiful industry. Good. Now, I will try to tell a story. I try not to be an academic for a few minutes, and I will try to tell the story from my past as a chef in Michelin-starred restaurants, but also from the time when I was a very young researcher and I started my PhD many years ago in the world of haute cuisine, and how I was fascinated when I basically met my stars. Right, when I was a chef, these people I talked to, these were the role models. And finally they were in front of me and I could ask them all the questions I always wanted to ask them. And I do this through the lens of aesthetics. Actually something that Babis is responsible for, because many years ago we got in contact because I showed him some of my work. And like it very often happens when you're so deep in your work and you basically, it's in front of your nose, you sometimes need to step back, or a good friend has to come in and basically points to the obvious that you cannot see because you're so close. And he said, you know, you actually talk about aesthetics. And suddenly it was clear. Yes, it was about aesthetics, but at this point in time, I could not name it. So, a question, why Michelin-starred chefs? When you think about, at least we try to believe that we are all creative. And probably this is one of the biggest questions in creativity research, whether creativity is inborn, whether it is developed. I believe it is probably a bit of both. And think about the creativity of a child. When a child starts to learn how to draw a tree, for the child, it's a very new creative act. It's something new, it's exciting. But of course for us who have done that since many, many years, when we know how this works, it's nothing exciting. So I was very much interested in trying to understand creativity at the top level. So really the expert level creativity, which of course naturally it's a very elitist approach. But I also believe that if we want to learn something fundamental, something essential about a phenomenon, it helps to learn from the best as well. And another reason is of course a personal interest, because I like eating, obviously, and I have been a chef, so I'm still fascinated by that industry. But there's also a very good reason, academically or from a research perspective, that we actually have a guide called the Michelin Guide, there are others as well, like the Gourmet Guide, where it is basically globally, almost globally, and publicly acknowledged who is creative and who is not creative. This does not mean that the chef who does not have a star is not creative, but at least here we have a reference point and we can say, look, there it's written, you know, so the sample is justified, so to speak. And these are the reasons why I looked into Michelin-starred chefs. Now, why creativity and aesthetics? Babis already mentioned the importance of aesthetics, but from a research perspective, it's also very interesting because aesthetics was actually only researched from the perspective of judges who look at the quality of the aesthetic quality of an invention, of a product or service, and it has rarely been brought into connection with creativity itself, and there's almost no research done that tries to understand or better understand the aesthetic knowing, aesthetic knowledge of the creator. So basically during the creative process. And I think this is a fascinating question. It's very, very difficult to research, as you can imagine, because if you think about creativity, the thing that fascinates us is actually that thing that we cannot grab, right? So we can study the creative person on the one side, and we can say, well, they are difficult people, or they are funny people, or they're grumpy people, and we can look at the outcome. and we can dissect that, we can take it apart, we can maybe see certain kind of patterns that we can replicate. Just a little side story, you probably all know Zalando, the big online clothes market. They run artificial intelligence at the moment. Of course, it's a very hot topic, artificial intelligence and human creativity, right? Where's the overlap? And they can, within a millisecond, analyze the 2,000 top sellers of dresses, and the artificial intelligence can within 5 minutes create another new 2,000 that aesthetically replicate the form of the dress that was the bestseller, right? I don't think it will be at the level of Karl Lagerfeld. It will be not something really new, but it's probably good enough for 80% of the market, right? And especially at this price level. So these are the very reasons. The thing in between the creative process, that is really the fascinating part. Let me just go quickly back here, just to give you an idea what this aesthetic all entails, because aesthetic is a very fuzzy concept. When we think about aesthetics, we very often think about the things that we see, the visual. And in philosophy, there's very often a very close link between aesthetics and beauty. And I think this is very much justified. But beauty also in other things that we can sense. So there can be beauty in taste. There can be beauty in a fragrance. Think about the parfum. I will talk about this later. There can be beauty in the things that we hear. Music, of course. And here, just to give you an example of how far these top chefs actually go. This is a dish. It's a sea urchin. Dish created by Richard Eckebuss, a Dutch chef in Hong Kong. And he actually hired an industrial designer who created a plate just for that particular dish, right? It will not be used afterwards for any other dish. It's just for this particular dish. Just to give you a little overview of the chefs that I have studied, over 3 dozen Michelin-starred chefs. And for those of you who don't know the Michelin system, so there is a big gourmand, it's called. It's basically a very good fine dining restaurant would get this kind of award. And then the star system starts from 1 star to 3 star. Okay? And 3-star restaurants are very, very rare in the world. Maybe around 120. The figures, of course, change every year, but it's very rare if you look at the amount of restaurants available in the world. So most chefs that I visited, that I studied, were in Europe, UK, Spain, France, Germany, Austria, and so on. And then, of course, at my school also we did a check of our sense making of these interviews with so-called meilleur ouvrier de France. This is a title that some of the craftsmen in France have, and that is basically a sign that they are at the top of their craft and they are responsible for the education and training of the next generation. And this was an important step, and then we did another round of interviews with people in the Netherlands and Singapore and so on. Now, one part or one phenomenon that came out is that we found something that we titled aesthetic composing. And it's really literally a composing, like Johann Sebastian Bach would compose his music. These chefs compose, and of course they have very different backgrounds, and I will introduce some of the chefs afterwards and tell a bit of their background story and their vita. And essential in that composing are 3 elements, and I think they are really fundamental, and also I don't have empirical evidence for that. I believe that we can find them in many other fields as well, where there is a creative process that is aesthetic emotion, aesthetic simplicity and aesthetic harmony. Now, emotion is probably the easiest to understand intuitively. It happens when we see something, we smell something, we touch something, and we have a positive or negative feel about it, hopefully positive, right? But if you think about the world of art, certain paintings are very powerful, they were very important for the history of art, but they are somehow disturbing. Think about Picasso's Guernica, right? It's not necessarily a beautiful picture, painting, but it is a very important one, and it has its own aesthetics. Then simplicity, it's very, very difficult. Why? Because I think this is really the mastery. This is where you can see the master. Because it's like Einstein, as simple as possible, but no simpler. Like a very good piece of art where you don't want to put something more, but you also don't want to take something out. It is exactly how it should be. And actually we can show that, and I'm sure that you have all experienced that. I'm thinking back to my beloved school back home, where the students also cater all the F&B outlets. And sometimes we give them a bit more creative freedom to do something, to write a little menu in the food court where all the faculty members eat and all the guests that come. And sometimes they are over-ambitious. And you get a dish that has certain elements that are very, very interesting, but it's overloaded. There is a cuisine called fusion cuisine. We always sarcastically say this is confusion cuisine because there are simply certain elements in there that do not work yet. Maybe you can picture a teenager. A teenager needs to learn how to grow up, and in that process of growing up, sometimes becomes extreme. Right? They have to go to the boundaries. They need to check and to tone down afterwards and to realize, okay, probably here somewhere is the real life. Right? This is how I can continue to develop. And harmony is of course something that I guess all human beings naturally want to achieve. It is simply the balance of the different ingredients together. Right? And that's a very interesting starting point, harmony, for many chefs, especially the more avant-garde chefs, to basically deconstruct the harmony. A famous chef, Ferran Adrià, that probably many of you have heard of. He had the famous restaurant close to Barcelona called El Bulli. And he became known as the godfather of molecular gastronomy. Now, molecular gastronomy is a term that was invented by a journalist to have some very fancy title for the first newspaper clip that was written about this new style of cuisine. It's totally wrong, because boiling an egg is molecular, right? There's nothing new in the term molecular gastronomy. The chefs actually talk about avant-garde cuisine, so an artistic approach to cooking. And what Ferran Adrià did, among many other things, is that he looked at this aesthetic harmony and he used deconstruction. So basically, I'll give you a very simple example. A cucumber salad. You slice, you dice, or you cut the cucumber in any form or shape, and then you add normally some form of acidity, lemon juice, vinegar, salt and pepper. And he said, can we not reverse that? Can we not basically take the juice of the cucumber and make it the vinaigrette, make it the acidic part, right, the juicy part, and then we look for a very mellow citrus fruit that can be eaten like this, and we basically assemble these elements, these essential elements, in a completely different way. And this is a very logical and very easy approach to come up already with some potentially very exciting new things by simply deconstructing what we already know. Now, the first chef that I want to introduce here, because
So what did you do?
Sorry?
So what did he do?
He took a very mellow lemon fruit that you can eat, so like you like the pomelo. So it's not very high in acidity, very pleasant to eat. And he took the cucumber and he made a juice out of the cucumber and then marinated the pomelo
So he
fruit.
actually did it? Then?
He did it, yeah, he did that. Yes, yes.
Thank you.
Yes. The first chef I want to introduce today is Fergus Henderson. Henderson is actually a self-taught chef. Has his one Michelin-starred restaurant in London. He has been an architect in his previous life, and he is a real connoisseur. And he was the first one. Might sound a bit strange, because actually that should be a very natural form of eating, but he basically reintroduced the nose to tail eating, right? So basically very like I said, a very ancient and natural form of eating, because if you kill an animal, we should have the respect to make use of as many parts as possible. And this is what he does. So basically he gets the entire animal in, and you would get pig shanks, you would get the ears, you get the snout, everything cooked to a Michelin star level. Right? Of course, it's not for everybody, this kind of food, but he has a competitive edge because of that, unique selling proposition, and works very well. It's a very simple environment, almost like a artisan cafe or philosopher's cafe. White walls, wooden chairs, wooden tables, very simple environment, delicious food, and a very interesting person. Really, you see he enjoys his own food and he becomes part of the product, right? So this is probably creativity on a simple idea level, reintroducing something that we do for thousands of years. It's not so much in the creative preparation of the food itself, right? It's basically the concept of eating the entire beast that he brought back to the culinary scene. Then here's the man that I already talked about, Ferran Adrià. Fascinating person. I still remember the interview that I had with him, and it's 11 years ago that I talked to him. It took me about 20 minutes to break the barrier that was between us, because he has at this time he spoke to about 10 journalists a day, and he thought, I'm a journalist, and I needed to convince him, I don't want to know why you wanted to become a chef, because they all have the same answers like me, because we loved what our mothers were cooking, right? And they took us in the kitchen early on, and this was kind of the impetus for us to become chefs. So it really took me 20 minutes, but then it was an amazing conversation that we had. And just to show you how he really changed and fundamentally altered the culinary scene. So his signature dish with which he became really famous is the melon caviar. Now, for those of you who have not had the chance to eat that, it's basically the essence of what became known as molecular gastronomy. You have two chemicals, and of course this is always the biggest criticism of molecular gastronomy, that they use certain chemicals in the cooking. But basically how it works is that you can choose any liquid of your choice. So you choose melon juice and add one chemical, and then you put it through this drop dispenser, and you put it in cold water that has the other chemical in there. And what happens the moment the liquid touches the water, it creates a viscous shell around the juice, but inside is liquid. So when you eat these pearls, like caviar pearls, they explode in your mouth. They have the same mouth feel, as we say, the same texture, but they taste after melon. Fascinating. So this was his signature dish. But for the managers in the room, those people who work in organizations on a strategic level, I think what is very interesting And of course, this is something that they tried many years ago at Siemens as well. And I had the pleasure to work as an external consultant for Google, where this, to this date, works, I think, quite well, is the separation of the daily operations from the creative processes. I don't know how many of you have ever seen a professional kitchen. It is like the army. The moment the doors open of the restaurant, it's a very regimented process, and there is only one boss in the kitchen. I never question that. Of course, it has changed slightly. The choleric shouting head chefs that I still experience becoming less, but there's still a clear line of command. And what Ferranate realized is this kind of creativity will be killed in such an environment. So basically what he said is, in order to really work creatively at the level like he intended to do, he rented a laboratory space in the center of Barcelona, where he brought together experts from different domains. Of course, relevant domains like an industrial designer, nutritionists, and so on, who then, outside the pressures and organizational pressures of the restaurant, could work creatively together, right? Like in any artistic environment. And in addition to that closed space, what of course is very interesting, when you bring together people from different domains, a colleague of ours, Franz Johansson, calls that the Medici effect, right? You can sometimes find things in a neighboring discipline, and you say, wow, if I just translate it a tiny bit and bring it over, it can have tremendous effects, positive effects in my field, right? And this kind of bringing together and creating a hotspot, a creative hotspot, worked really magic. Now the restaurant is closed. He has created the El Bulli Foundation, and they do great stuff. For example, one thing that they work on at the moment is the Bullipedia. We all know Wikipedia, right? But this is really a almost scientific library of every existing gastronomic knowledge in the world brought together, right? It's not quite up and running yet, but he's very close with that, and a magician, a philosopher, a scientist, everything in one person. It's a really fascinating person. Another great character, Dieter Müller, now semi-retired, probably one of our best chefs in Germany, 3 Michelin stars. Very kind person and very quiet man. He was a very quiet leader, had a very good reputation in the industry. But he comes from my part of Germany, and we are called the Scots of Germany. We like to keep our money together, and it drove him crazy that for lunchtime he couldn't fill his restaurant. 3 Michelin stars, many courses, you spend at least 4 hours, right? And people wouldn't come for lunch. Dinner he was always fully booked. So I said, how can I attract the people maybe from the closer areas where the hotel and the restaurant is for lunchtime? They said, first of all, we need to do something with the price. It needs to be very attractive price-wise. But then he said, look, they don't want to spend the time. So actually, they want to taste Dieter Müller. They want to have the big degustation menu, but short. And this is what he did. He basically made 5 courses consisting of 4 to 5 courses per course in miniature version. So amuse-bouche menu. Great success. Many other chefs copied that afterwards. Right? And I think for the purpose that he was looking for, a really, really good idea. And then just, I put down here sweetbread and crayfish, just to give you a bit of insight how creativity sometimes happens. He went into the walk-in fridge And one of his young chefs put the sweetbread next to the crayfish, and he got angry. He said he knows that the fish should be somewhere else because there could be cross-contamination, right? But then he said, wow, why don't we bring this together? And he actually worked on the combination of sweetbread with crayfish, and it became one of his most famous dishes afterwards. So sometimes serendipity really helps. Juan Roca. Now, for many years in a row, he was voted #1 restaurant in the San Pellegrino list. 3 Michelin stars, 3 brothers. Therefore, the 3 worlds. This is Juan Roca. He's the boss. He is basically responsible for all the savory dishes, and one of his brothers is doing the patisserie, the sweet world, and the other brother is doing is a sommelier. Now, the first thing I want to mention here is when they invited me for lunch, what was fascinating is how they integrate wine in the food. Now, normally, classically, we would talk about corresponding wines, right? So you have a nice braised beef cheek, 4 hours slowly cooked. So probably a Barolo would go quite well, or the wine we had last night. The last one would work perfectly. But here, the wine becomes an ingredient. So basically, you are almost forced to take the wine flight that goes with the wine, and when you try the dish, it's very good, but it's not finished. And when you drink the wine, you immediately understand, now it's finished. It's part of the ingredient, it's not corresponding, right? Very exciting. But they're probably best known or became very famous because of this invention. And he told me the story how it happened. One morning he was standing in the kitchen with his 2 brothers, and his wife passed by. And he said, I love her perfume. If I could just dedicate a dish to her with that fragrance. But of course this doesn't go well, a female perfume in a savory dish. So it was automatically the thought, okay, it needs to be some sort of dessert. And his brother listened to that. And I said, well, let's do it. And they went to a big perfume house. They went to Donna Karen himself and asked, okay, what are the flavor components that you use? And they basically rebuilt Donna Karen New York for women as a dessert. So when they serve that, you get a taste of the original perfume. You smell, and then you eat it, and it really works. It's not some, we tried and it's almost there. It works. It's exactly the same flavor combination. Then we have Michel Poirot, very famous name all around the world because of his father and uncle, who were one of the proponents of introducing the nouvelle cuisine in the world. And little story here. I think aesthetically it becomes probably very clear here. He's a big fan of Marc Rothko, the painter, and that's one of his dishes. I think the similarity is very clear. But of course, what is interesting, this is 2-dimensional. Here we have more dimensions because we can taste it. We have the temperature, we have even the sound of food sometimes, right? That's why we all like potato crisps. And once you take one, you cannot stop, right? It's also because of the sound. And then a little story here that shows how deep philosophers and how deep thinkers these chefs are. Now, this is something that Michel Poirot invented. This is a layer of milk skin, a fraction of a millimeter thick. Now, I'm sure in Greece you still have proper milk. It becomes increasingly difficult to find in Germany, and in Switzerland sometimes we can still find it. But basically in the past, when you boiled milk and you let it cool down a bit, there was the skin on it, right? And that's what he did. And he was the only one in his family who liked the skin. Everybody else hated him. I said, but I want to replicate this childhood memory. Now, the concept of childhood memory is something every chef talks about. Because this, if you can replicate that and the audience can buy into and feel the childhood memory, you want them for life, right? This is when we go back home to our mothers or grandmothers and they cook our favorite dish. Nothing can be wrong, right? That just works. Now, he said, of course, that's a cool thing, but I cannot boil always half a liter of milk and wait. I have to run a restaurant. So he also invented the machine that can create the milk skin, but on industrial scale, so that he can use it in a dish in his restaurant. And then he said, okay, but what do I do with a milk skin? So it's not very exciting in a 3-star Michelin restaurant to eat milk skin, right? I need to tell a story, I need to create a dish. And then he said, okay, now let me think. And he basically fills it with mousseron. And mousseron is a mushroom that grows in the field where the cows are. And it only grows because of the digestive system of the cows. So he closes the circle from milk, cow, mushroom, right? And this is how these guys think, right? It's a deep story. It's a deep felt desire to create something out of the norm. Adubis. He is a protege of Ferran Adrià, and he just blew me away with this story because I find it so relevant for the service industry when we have to when we have to handle customer complaints. This story is just, for me, amazing. Now, north of Spain, close to San Sebastian, avant-garde cuisine. One of the dishes was sardine ice cream. Now, sardine, very fatty fish, very fishy, right? Normally we know it from the barbecue or maybe put in vinegar, cold. It's a very strong fish. We cannot connect it to ice cream. And of course, his customers couldn't connect it to ice cream. So 9 out of 10 customers bitterly complained. Normally these chefs, and I believe Adubis as well, have a big ego, right? Otherwise they couldn't be chefs. But he was a very clever businessman, very kind person, and he said, you know, I could easily say to these 9 complaining customers, you know, who are you? I'm the big star, I have 3 Michelin stars, everybody knows me in the world, I don't care what you say, right? But this is not what he did. So he went back to his sous chef, to his inner circle of advisors, said, what's wrong? I love this dish. And they all said, it's great. And it makes sense to put it at this point in the menu, because a menu is like an album of your favorite pop star or singer, right? There's a logic to it. And he said, but what is it? What is it? And then he spoke to a friend who was a psychologist. And he said, you know, it's very easy. These people have no reference point. And this happened in Germany when they introduced the kiwi. You know how the kiwi? You know how the Germans called the kiwi, how they called the kiwi the first time? Hairy potato. And the taste, of course, if you taste something that you never tasted before, you need to find connecting points, reference points. So maybe if you eat a kiwi, you say, okay, there's a bit of pineapple in it, right? Maybe something else, and you build your kind of cognitive boxes. And his psychologist friend said, you know, do a very simple thing. Before you serve that dish, send the waiter or waitress to the customer and tell them to say exactly the same thing, the following thing. Tell the customer, do you want to engage with us in a culinary adventure that is absolutely outstanding and it will be very exciting? Or if you don't want to be so adventurous today, we will bring you an alternative dish, very delicious, but less adventurous. Of course, we all want to be adventurous. Right? Afterwards, almost no complaints, because the only person they could complain about is themselves. So, a trick, I don't know if they liked it more, but at least they didn't complain about it, right? And it became part of the entire experience. So, very clever. So now I connect, and I'm good with the time, I think so. Aesthetic emotion. Now, André Jiang, very famous chef, when we asked him about how he creates emotions, and this links very nicely back to what I just said about Chef Alvarez. He said, you know, in order to create an emotion, you need to tap and connect with something that people know and that people like. And he said, you know, very often I either use humor, that a dish is served in a humorous way. For example, Heston Blumenthal, a very famous chef from the UK, when he served his seafood platter, you had a big mussel, and at the time you still had the iPods. He had an iPod in there with earphones, and you would listen to the sound of the waves while eating your seafood platter. Right? That's humorous. It's a nice gimmick, right? But he said, you know, I do things like Snickers. Everybody likes a Snickers. Everybody likes Coca-Cola. But I basically use those flavor components, and I turn it into a properly grown-up dessert, right? But the moment you eat it, you eat a Snickers, and everybody likes it, right? Aesthetic simplicity. Raymond Blanc. He was actually the godfather of molecular gastronomy, but when he was asked by Ferran Adrià and others whether he wants to be the front man, he said no. Because for me, what we have done with that molecular approach was basically a scientific approach to cooking to better understand certain things and to improve the craft, right? And maybe give some impetus for creativity as well. But I don't want to have this molecular idea at the forefront of food. And a self-taught chef, and his master was Professor Nicholas Curti, a physicist from the University of Oxford, who was interested in food. And one story he said is, you know, I got crazy. I tried in my kitchen to make a souffle and it wouldn't work. So I called Nicholas 3 o'clock in the morning, said, you have to come here, you have to show me how we make a souffle, right? And they actually figured out how to make the perfect souffle in terms of process, and it works great. Now, and of course he clearly said simplicity is really, you know, the mastery. This is really where you see the master's hand. And if you look at this plate, he has 2 Michelin stars. It is very simple, but it's also very beautiful, right? And actually, it is not as simple as it looks at first sight, because simplicity is not simplistic. It's the last refuge of complexity. This salmon is actually cooked, but it's cooked at 53 degrees. So it keeps its color because the protein is not yet percolated, right? And when you eat it, it has nothing to do with sushi. You feel it is cooked, but it's a different texture than your typically barbecued salmon or any other salmon that is cooked at a higher temperature.
Vacuum cooked?
Sous vide and at 53 degrees. Yeah. Aesthetic harmony. Corey Lee said, you know, this is when it then all comes together. This is here he talked about masterpieces, and masterpieces that can be served at any time, but he said, you know, generations. I always give to my students the example of maybe a Chanel costume for the ladies, or a black Armani suit for men.
Classic. It's
classic. It works, right? And as a dish, this is maybe not Michelin level yet, but I think we have all eaten it. Hot raspberries with vanilla ice cream. If you think about this combination, the temperature differences, the texture, it is almost perfection, right? It's very simple, but it is almost perfection, right? And this is something that, of course, at some point was invented as well. Maybe it was in a serendipitous way, right? Because this was left in the fridge, and somebody had the idea to heat up the raspberries because they maybe didn't look so good anymore. This is very often how things like that are developed. But the combination is just glorious. It is just very, very exciting. Good. This was it from my side, and I believe Barbies will have a lot of questions now.
Thank you
for me.